somewhere beneath the freezing waters of the North Sea. Resting in darkness at a depth of 150 meters lies a steel coffin. It has been there since February 1945. Inside it, the remains of 73 men who never came home. And inside it, something else, something that, had it reached its destination, may have changed the outcome of the war, and perhaps the decades that followed. This is not a story the world was supposed to know. For years, the wreck was classified. The cargo it carried was classified. The mission itself was classified. Even after the guns fell silent and the Third Reich collapsed into rubble, certain governments preferred that this particular submarine and everything it held remained exactly where it was, at the bottom of the sea, in silence, in darkness, forgotten. But the ocean eventually gives up its secrets. The submarine was U-864, a Type IXD-2 long-range U-boat, one of the largest and most capable vessels in the Kriegsmarine's arsenal, built for distance, built for endurance, built for missions that ordinary submarines could never complete. At over 87 meters in length, it could cross entire oceans without resurfacing, carrying enormous payloads across thousands of miles of hostile water. In the wrong hands, with the right cargo, it was a weapon not of destruction, but of transformation. And in February 1945, it was carrying something that the Allied powers feared more than almost anything else. To understand why U-864 mattered, you have to understand where Germany stood at the beginning of 1945. The war was, by almost any honest military analysis, already lost. The Eastern Front had collapsed into a catastrophic retreat. Allied forces were pressing through France, through Belgium, through the crumbling borders of the Reich itself. Berlin was within reach of Soviet artillery. The dream of a 1,000-year Reich had become a nightmare measured in weeks, perhaps months. But not everyone had surrendered to that reality. Not the SS, not the architects of Germany's secret weapons programs. Not the men who believed, with a desperation that bordered on madness, that one final technological breakthrough could reverse the tide. That Japan, Germany's ally across the world, might hold the key to something powerful enough to change everything. U-864 was the bridge between those two desperate worlds. The submarine's commander was Captain Lieutenant Rolf Reimar Wolfram. He was 33 years old, experienced, decorated, the kind of officer the Kriegsmarine trusted with missions that never appeared in official logs. Wolfram had taken command of U-864 in late 1943, and by early 1945 he had been selected for one of the most sensitive operations the German Naval Command had authorized in the final months of the war. Operation Caesar. The name itself sounds like mythology, like empire, like something carved into stone. And in a way, it was. It was Germany's last gambit, a covert transfer of advanced military technology and materials to Imperial Japan, delivered via submarine across thousands of miles of ocean, bypassing the Allied naval blockade that had strangled German supply lines for years. The cargo loaded into U-864 was not conventional war supplies. It was not torpedoes or ammunition or fuel. What filled the steel hull of that submarine, carefully packed into specialized containers, cataloged and sealed, was the raw material of weapons of mass destruction. Roughly 62 tons of liquid mercury in sealed steel flasks, intended to assist Japanese weapons manufacturing programs. Jet engine blueprints, rocket technology drawings, craft components, technical specialists, German engineers and scientists who were being transported personally to share their knowledge with Japanese counterparts. Men whose names have never been fully disclosed. Men whose expertise, transferred successfully, could have extended the Pacific War by years. 62 tons of mercury. That number has never stopped being haunting. Because mercury doesn't decay. It doesn't dissolve. It doesn't disappear. Every single kilogram of that cargo still exists somewhere beneath the North Sea. And for decades, it has been slowly, quietly, leaching into the water. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. U-864 departed Kiel in late January 1945, already behind schedule. The submarine had experienced mechanical problems, engine failures that had delayed the mission twice. These delays were not just frustrating, they were, in retrospect, deeply significant. Because every day U-864 remained in port, British naval intelligence was listening. The Allies had broken the German Enigma code years earlier. They were reading Kriegsmarine communications with a clarity the Germans never suspected. And the British knew U-864 was coming. The submarine sailed toward Bergen, Norway, to complete repairs at the massive German U-boat base carved into the fjord. Bergen was a critical waypoint, one of the most heavily fortified naval facilities in occupied Europe. Concrete bunkers, anti-aircraft guns, repair docks built deep into rock. If U-864 could finish its repairs there and slip out into the open Atlantic, the mission would have a genuine chance of succeeding. It never left Norwegian waters. On February 9, 1945, the British submarine HMS Venturer was patrolling submerged in the waters off the Norwegian coast near the island of Fedge. Her commander was Lieutenant Jimmy Launders, 25 years old, and possessed of a calm, methodical brilliance that would make history that afternoon. Venturer had been given intelligence, precise intelligence, that a large German submarine was operating in those waters. Launders was hunting. What followed was one of the most remarkable feats in the entire history of submarine warfare. Launders detected U-864 through sound alone. Both submarines were submerged. Neither could see the other. For over an hour, Launders tracked the acoustic signature of U-864, calculating its course, its speed, its depth, its bearing, all by hand, all through intuition and mathematics, feeding data to his fire control team in real time. Then, at the precise moment his calculations converged, he fired a spread of 4 torpedoes. It was the first and, to this day, the only time in recorded naval history that one submerged submarine successfully sank another submerged submarine. U-864 broke apart in seconds. There were no survivors, no emergency transmissions, no debris field visible from the surface. 73 men, the Mercury, the blueprints, the engineers, the last desperate cargo of a dying regime, all of it vanished into 150 meters of black, cold water. And then the silence began. For decades, the wreck's precise location was uncertain. The British knew roughly where it had gone down. The Norwegians knew something terrible lay beneath those waters. But the war ended. Priorities shifted. The Cold War began. And a sunken German submarine filled with classified cargo became exactly the kind of problem that powerful governments preferred not to examine too closely. Then, in 2003, Norwegian authorities began a serious, systematic search. Using advanced sonar technology, naval research vessels began mapping the seafloor near Fedge with extraordinary precision. They were looking for a ghost. What they found was a grave. The wreck of U-864 was located in 2 main sections, broken apart by the torpedo detonation. Resting on a sandy seabed 150 meters below the surface, the sections were separated by several hundred meters. And surrounding them, partially buried in the sediment, were the steel flasks. The mercury containers, thousands of them, many intact, many compromised, slowly releasing their contents into the surrounding water. The discovery triggered an immediate crisis, not historical, but environmental. Mercury at that concentration, in that location, represented a genuine ecological threat to Norwegian fishing waters. The question of what to do with U-864 became one of the most complex and expensive decisions the Norwegian government had ever faced. Not how to memorialize it, not how to excavate it, but whether to bury it, to seal the entire wreck beneath a concrete cap, preserving it permanently in place, containing the mercury at the cost of never allowing the dead to rest in marked graves. That debate continued for years. Experts disagreed. Fishermen were afraid. Families of the 73 men who died inside that hull, German families, many of them elderly, some of them gone before the wreck was even found, asked for respect, asked for acknowledgement, asked for something that the word contamination site simply could not provide. There is a weight to this story that goes beyond statistics. 73 men. Most of them were young. Most of them were following orders, as soldiers do, in a war they did not start and could not stop. Wolfram himself was a professional naval officer doing what professional naval officers do, executing the mission, trusting his crew, sailing into danger on behalf of a government that had already lost. None of them knew that a British submarine was tracking them through the dark water. None of them had any warning. The torpedo that killed them was calculated and fired by a man who would later describe it as simply doing his job. That, perhaps, is the most devastating thing about U-864. Not the mercury, not the secret cargo, not the geopolitical implications of what might have happened if the submarine had reached Japan, but the simple human reality of 73 men who went into the water and never came back, who lie there still, and whose story the world was never meant to hear. And yet the questions remain. They accumulate, one upon another, like sediment. If U-864 had reached Japan, if those blueprints, those engineers, those tons of materials had transferred successfully, what then? Japanese weapons programs were already advanced by 1945. The atomic bombs fell in August. But the Pacific War's end was not as inevitable in early 1945 as history makes it seem in retrospect. Every week of additional capability for Japan meant additional American casualties, additional Allied deaths, additional time for events to unfold that we have no way of modeling or predicting. History is brutally indifferent to what almost happened. But it is worth sitting for just a moment with the weight of what U-864 was carrying toward the world. There are also questions about the cargo itself that have never been fully answered. The official manifest, such as it is, lists the mercury and the technical materials. But historians who have examined the original German records, those that survived the destruction of the final months of the war, have noted discrepancies. Items that appear on early loading records that do not appear on later ones. Weights that don't entirely reconcile. The possibility debated carefully and seriously by researchers that U-864 may have been carrying additional materials never officially acknowledged, documents, specific technical files, perhaps individuals whose identities remain, to this day, unconfirmed. We may never know. That is the nature of this story. It was designed from the beginning to be unknowable. The mercury contamination continues. Norwegian environmental surveys conducted regularly in the area around the wreck site show elevated mercury levels in sediment and in certain fish populations. The debate over how to permanently remediate this site, whether to seal it, whether to attempt partial salvage, whether modern technology has changed the calculus of what's possible, has never been fully resolved. The wreck is monitored. It is studied. But the 62 tons remain where they fell on February 9, 1945, slowly, imperceptibly, becoming part of the sea itself. Jimmy Launders, the British officer who sank U-864, received the Distinguished Service Order for the action. He went on to live a full life, dying in 1991. He rarely spoke publicly about the sinking. When he did, he was precise and professional. He described the mathematics of the attack, the calculations, the decision to fire. He did not describe what he thought about after. He did not describe the silence after the torpedoes found their target. Perhaps there is nothing to say about that. Perhaps silence is the only honest response. Wolfram has no grave. His crew has no grave. The seafloor near Fedge is their monument, unmarked, unconsecrated, covered in cold water and contaminated sediment and the accumulated weight of 80 years of silence. History remembers the decisive battles. It remembers Midway and Stalingrad and Normandy. It builds museums and erects memorials and writes textbooks with clean narrative arcs. turning points and victories, and the inevitable march toward Allied triumph. But history is also made of the things that didn't happen. The missions that failed. The cargo that never arrived. The submarines that went into the dark and never came out. U-864 is one of those stories. One of the real ones. Not the triumphant kind, but the kind that asks something of you after you've heard it. The kind that stays. Because somewhere in the North Sea, right now, in water so cold and dark that no light from the surface has ever reached it, the last mission of a dying empire is still waiting. The blueprints are dissolved. The engineers are bone. But the mercury persists, patient and indifferent. Seeping outward through the sediment, a chemical ghost of a war that the world spent 80 years trying to leave behind. Some things don't let you leave them behind. Some things wait.